How did it happen that millions of people almost simultaneously decided that they had always been French, German, Italian, or Russian? Just yesterday, a person identified themselves by their village, their parish, their province, and then suddenly they were told that their true destiny was tied to a nation, a language, and a border. And the strangest thing here is not politics, but documents. In the archives of France, Germany, Austria, Russia, and Spain, censuses, church books, and local records from the late 18th and early 19th centuries have been preserved. And there, again and again, the same detail appears. Huge groups of people speak a local vernacular with no clear name. That is exactly how it is written in the papers. Local speech, language of the common folk, unknown. But how can a language exist without a name? And how can an entire people live for centuries without the national label that seems so natural to us? To understand this paradox, you have to see Europe itself as it was then, not the map from a textbook, but the living reality. A city in the 17th or 18th century was cramped and dark. Houses stood wall to wall. Trade and work went on below. Families lived above. Under the very roofs, the poor crowded into tiny spaces. The streets were narrow. Down the center there were often ditches for draining filth. At night the city almost came to a halt. Little light, little water, a heavy smell. By our standards, everyday life was rough and deeply uncomfortable. And against this background, another question arises. Where, in such a world, did the grand cathedrals, palaces, and engineering systems come from? Cathedrals rose to heights of around 100 meters. Aqueducts carried water for many kilometers. Palaces were built with enormous halls, complex layouts, and carefully designed heating. The gap is striking. Everyday life seems primitive, while the architecture and engineering look as though they were created by an entirely different level of organization. In the 19th century, the French historian Jules Michelet wrote about the strange feeling that came over him when reading old sources. As if two different realities coexisted in the very same years. One poor, superstitious, and filthy. The other precise, monumental, and technically complex. He drew no sweeping conclusions. But he left the question hanging, and that question matters, because from there, it leads us directly to languages. Until the end of the 18th century, a national language hardly existed anywhere in the modern sense. There was Latin. That was the language of the church, scholarship, and diplomacy. There was French, the language of high society. It was used far beyond the borders of France, including at the Russian court, and below that level lived hundreds and thousands of local forms of speech. They changed from region to region, and sometimes from village to village. People from neighboring regions often understood each other only with difficulty. A Frenchman from Brittany might poorly understand a resident of Provence. A German from Bavaria did not always speak easily with a Prussian. In the lands of the future, Italy, the differences between local speech were so great that people sometimes switched to gestures, and this was not an exception, but the norm of that era. A person felt they belonged to a parish, a town, a land, a lord, a religious community, but not to a nation in our present sense. This is a very important point. If people on a mass scale did not call themselves French, German, or Italian, then the familiar picture of ancient nations requires serious re-examination. By the way, if details like this interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not myths, but the strange junctions of facts that usually go unnoticed. The turn begins in France after the Revolution. Everyone has heard about freedom and equality, but something else is remembered far less often. In 1794, Abbé Grégoire presented his report on the need to eradicate patois and make the French language universal. Patois are local vernaculars and dialects. A sharp paradox emerges. The revolution that spoke of freedom very quickly took up linguistic leveling. The official explanation sounded reasonable. Uniform laws, an army that could understand itself, convenient trade, a common school. But the methods were harsh. Teachers were encouraged to monitor the way children spoke. Priests were pushed toward conducting services only in standard French. Local texts were confiscated. Some chronicles were rewritten. Some were simply destroyed. And this already looks not just like enlightenment, but like a large-scale remaking of memory. At almost the same time, similar processes were underway in other countries. In the German lands, Johann Gottlieb Fichte delivers his addresses to the German nation. This is not abstract philosophy. It is a call to gather a people around a common language and a common political project. In Russia, Nikolai Karamzin not only writes the history of the Russian state, but also strengthens the literary norm of the Russian language as the foundation of a common identity. In Italy, Alessandro Manzoni creates a model literary Italian through artistic prose, even though before that a single pan-Italian language had effectively not existed. And all of this happens in an astonishingly short span of time, roughly from the 1790s to the 1860s. Less than 70 years. In such a short period by historical standards, Europe travels the path from a colorful mosaic of dialects to a system of national languages, national histories, and national states. Too fast. So fast that the very pace of the process becomes a separate mystery. The official version explains this through the Enlightenment, rising literacy, schools, print, and the Industrial Revolution. But there is a weak point here. The printing press appeared much earlier. Back in the 15th century, literacy grew gradually, not in a sudden explosion at one moment. The Industrial Revolution began in England earlier than elsewhere. Yet it was precisely the English path to the national model that proved distinctive and did not fully coincide with the continental scenario. That is why some researchers, whom the academic world often considers too bold, turn their attention to another coincidence. The end of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th are full of vague and poorly reconciled reports of upheavals, epidemics, sharp social shifts, gaps in local memory, strange breaks in the chronicles, as if the old world had not simply been reformed, but hastily reassembled, while people were simultaneously being given new names, new languages, and a new history. And this is where an entirely different, far more disturbing line of inquiry begins. Mass migrations at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century are usually explained in general terms: climate, wars, economic hardship. But if you look closely at the details, the picture becomes far more troubling. The period of sharp cooling, known as the Little Ice Age, was reaching its peak at exactly that time. Then came a blow that is known for certain. In 1815, Mount Tambora erupted. It was one of the most powerful eruptions in many thousands of years. The very next year entered history as the year without a summer. In 1816, crops failed in Europe and North America. Famine began. In some places, snow fell even in July, and it is precisely against this background that a strange gap appears in the demographic data. Censuses show a sharp population decline, where there had been neither a major war nor an obvious epidemic. In other places, on the contrary, new groups of people suddenly appear. Their origin is either unclear or described evasively. In the chronicles, there are villages listed as newly resettled. Provinces are first called deserted and then restored. This is no longer an accident. It is a recurring pattern. One detail is especially important. Records of unnamed languages, of local dialects without a clear designation, most often refer precisely to the period from roughly the 1770s to the 1820s. It is as if the administration was encountering people who could not be fitted into familiar categories. They spoke, but it was unclear in what language. They lived in the place, But where they had come from, the documents did not explain. The diary of the Swiss traveler Johann Georg Sulzer is revealing. In the 1780s, he traveled through most of Central Europe. In one entry, he describes a village in the foothills. According to him, the inhabitants spoke in an unnamed mixture, not in German, not in French, not in Italian, and not in Latin. But in their speech, one could hear traces of all these languages, and something else besides, something he could not name. The old inhabitants themselves explained it simply. Their great-grandfathers had come here from different places after the great pestilence. Since then, they had spoken in a mixed way. But what kind of pestilence it was, when it happened, and why there is almost no clear information about it, the chronicles do not explain. And this is not an isolated mention. Formulas like after the pestilence, after the great desolation, after the nameless calamity appear in documents from different countries with surprising frequency. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine precisely those traces of the past that usually remain in the margins of official history. It gets even more interesting from here. In the first half of the 19th century, national archives began to be created all across Europe. Formally, this looked like a triumph of enlightenment. States gathered documents, opened libraries, put the past in order. But this process had another side as well. Documents were not merely preserved. They were translated into official languages. Texts in obscure dialects were adapted. Latin sources were reworked for a new audience. And what could not be classified was often simply not included in the main body. Such papers disappeared. They were written off as secondary. Sometimes they perished in fires, of which there turned out to be suspiciously many in this period. From the beginning of the 19th century until the 1860s, fires in European archives happened again and again. Vienna, Warsaw, provincial repositories in France, Florence, and these are only the known cases. How much material vanished without a trace, we will never know. The German archivist Heinrich von Seibel wrote quite openly in the 1850s about the principles of forming a national archive. In his view, what should be preserved was that which speaks of the nation, and documents that create confusion and blur national identity were treated as secondary. The wording is critically important. If a source interferes with a coherent picture, its significance is downgraded. This is not a guess. It is a principle. And here everything turns upside down. If nations were an ancient and natural reality, why did they have to be assembled, purified, and completed so insistently? Why level languages? Why suppress dialects? Why create unified literary norms, shared heroes, and continuous national histories? What grows on its own usually does not require engineering on such a scale. So a hypothesis arises that cannot be declared the truth, but is also hard to ignore. Perhaps the 19th century was not only the century of nationalism. Perhaps it was also a century of recovery after a great catastrophe, after a series of climatic, epidemic, and social shocks, after the long dying out of entire regions, after the loss of memory. Imagine the consequences. The old die, and with them oral history departs. Families disappear. Ties between generations are broken. People resettle, mix together, forget former names, former customs, former speech. What remains is a heterogeneous population that somehow has to go on living. And then the elites, who preserved more knowledge and resources, begin to reassemble society. They give it a language. They give it a past. They give it a framework within which it can exist. But this version has a weak point. Everything happened far too synchronously. France, the German lands, Italy, Russia, Spain, Poland. In almost the same decades, national languages, canons, archives, and historical narratives were created there. Such a coincidence demands an explanation. Either everyone was reacting to the same common blow, or we are dealing not only with recovery, but with coordination. And that is already a very different conversation. There is another layer to this story, and it is far more concrete than secret societies and missing archives. It is about language. In the 19th century, language became not merely a means of communication, but an instrument for assembling a new order. When European scholars began comparing languages systematically, their discovery was regarded as a triumph of science. It turned out that many languages of Europe were related. They were traced back to a common ancestor, the so-called Proto-Indo-European language. But an important reservation arises immediately here. No one ever heard this language. It survives in no manuscript. It was reconstructed through calculation, through the comparison of forms, sounds, and grammatical patterns. This is an outstanding intellectual achievement. But it is still a reconstruction, not a record of living speech. And therein lies the paradox. We know not what this language certainly was, but what it had to have been, in order for the languages known to us to be logically derived from it. In other words, it is a model, a very powerful one, a very beautiful one, but still a model. This paradox is especially sharp in the case of Sanskrit. It is one of the oldest attested Indo-European languages, and at the same time one of the most complex. Its grammar astonished even 19th century scholars. The British researcher William Jones wrote that Sanskrit is more perfect in structure than Greek, richer in vocabulary than Latin, and subtler than both. For the science of the time, this was almost a shock. The most ancient language turned out not to be a crude beginning, but the summit of a complex system. From this arose an uncomfortable question. If one of the earliest known languages was already so developed, then where are the traces of earlier stages? Where are the cities, archives, schools, workshops of the culture that could have produced such linguistic precision? Official versions spoke of migrations of Indo-European tribes and cultural diffusion. But there were always gaps in these schemes. The exact dates are disputed. The routes are disputed. The original centers are disputed. And here the connection with the 19th century becomes especially curious. One of the founders of comparative linguistics was Franz Bopp. In 1816, he published a work on the conjugation of Sanskrit in comparison with Greek, Latin, Persian, and the Germanic languages. It is precisely this year that is often called the birthpoint of scientific comparative linguistics. And it is that same year, 1816, the year without a summer, the year after the eruption of Tambora, the year of climatic shock, crop failures, anxiety, and the feeling that the familiar world had cracked. A coincidence is possible. But it is too expressive a coincidence. It is precisely in an age of crisis that disciplines appear which are occupied with restoring what was lost. Archaeology, critical historiography, ethnography, folklore studies, all of them work with debris, with fragments, with what remained after a rupture. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not only theories, but also how they grow out of documents, languages, and forgotten trifles. Now it is important to look not at academic treatises, but at folk memory. The 19th century collected tales, songs, and legends with enormous zeal. The Brothers Grimm in the German lands, Alexander Afanasyev in Russia, collectors in Ireland, Scandinavia, the Balkans, and in a great many of these records, a strange motif repeats itself. Others lived here before us. The old people, the former people. They were stronger, taller, wiser. They built incredible things. Then they disappeared. They went into the hills, fell asleep under the earth, dissolved into the forests, and we came in their place. This motif is too widely spread to be dismissed simply as random fantasy. It appears in very different traditions, which means it may preserve the memory of some shared experience, of a change of epochs, of a break in continuity, of a world in which descendants no longer fully understood how the things they inherited had been made. Here begin the most controversial versions. One says this is the memory of the displacement of pre-Christian cultures. Another says it is the trace of a catastrophe after which people survived with scraps of knowledge. And a third, the most radical, allows for the literal memory of a preceding civilization. It sounds stark, but some material questions really are uncomfortable. There are structures for which official explanations are often too general. Enormous stone blocks, perfect fitting without mortar, roads through the most difficult terrain, aqueducts whose durability astonished even engineers of the modern era. In the 19th century, the French engineer Auguste Choisy frankly admitted that the function of Roman structures could be replicated, but the exact method of their construction was, in many cases, already unclear. He explained this by the loss of knowledge during the centuries of decline. And here is what is especially important. In the very same era, when nations were being created, Europe began building new structures in old styles. Banks, railway stations, parliaments, universities imitated antiquity, Gothic, the Renaissance. This is called historicism and eclecticism. Formally, everything is correct. But if we look more broadly, an interesting thought arises. What if this was not only fashion, but also an attempt to reproduce a model whose meaning was no longer fully understood? The same could have happened with language. In administrative documents from the late 18th and early 19th century, strange designations are often found. Local speech, unknown dialect, patois, without a clear name, without a clear classification. For the state, this was noise. For the reformer, it was material that had to be put in order. For the school, it was an obstacle. But for the historian, a completely different question is hidden here. What if some of these dialects were not simply corrupted versions of future national languages? Abbé Grégoire, known for his report on the need to eradicate patois in France, noted a curious thing. Many such dialects resisted systematization. The same person could use different forms of the same word without any visible rule. At first glance, this looked like chaos. But chaos does not always mean primitiveness. Sometimes it is a trace of disintegration. Not an underdeveloped language, but a fragmented one, the remnant of a system whose core has been lost. This changes the angle of view. In the 19th century, linguists and state reformers chose one dialect, purified it, standardized it, fixed it in grammars and schools, and then declared it correct. All other forms of speech became crude, local, corrupted, backward. Thus was born the illusion that the standard language was the oldest and the most authentic. But the opposite is also possible. The standard language could have been a new construction, convenient for the state, convenient for the school, convenient for the army and the courts, and living dialects could have preserved older layers that did not fit into the new scheme. And here, linguistics offers some very interesting clues. In isolated regions of Europe, so-called substrate vocabulary is still being found. These are words whose origin cannot be derived from known ancestral languages. Such layers exist in Basque. They exist in Celtic zones. They are found in the dialects of the Pyrenees and the Alps. Sometimes these are individual words. Sometimes they are whole groups of names for places, objects, natural phenomena. There is no etymology, which means that somewhere in the depths there was a source that has either been lost or not recognized. And against this background, children's texts look especially interesting. Counting out rhymes, lullabies, simple tunes that are passed on not through books but by voice. Folklorists have long noticed that the oldest layers of memory are often preserved precisely there. A mother sings to her child the way it was sung to her, and the meaning may disappear, but the sound remains. In several isolated areas of Europe, Researchers have indeed recorded words in lullabies that cannot be translated into the official languages. They continued to be sung even when their meaning was no longer understood, simply because that was the custom. This is a very important detail. Reform can rewrite a textbook. An archive can burn. A decree can ban a dialect. But intonation, a children's formula, an old refrain live longer. And then an almost frightening thought arises. Perhaps the 19th century did not simply create national languages. Perhaps it also covered over with them an older, more variegated, partially ruined linguistic landscape. We cannot prove this conclusively. It would be dishonest to say otherwise. But the chain of observations is too dense to ignore. The simultaneous suppression of dialects, the standardization of speech, the rewriting of historical narratives, archival gaps, folklore about a former people, words without etymology, lullabies without clear meaning. Taken together, all this looks less like smooth natural development than like the restoration of order after a major breakdown. That is why that very archival detail about people whose language had no name ceases to be a curiosity. It is no longer a minor bureaucratic oddity. It is a trace of an era when the world urgently needed to name itself anew, to divide, to describe, to establish norms, to create peoples, histories, and languages that looked ancient, whole, and natural. But beneath this even facade, another voice can still be heard, the voice of old dialects, the voice of words that survived reforms, the voice of memory that did not disappear, but went deeper. And perhaps it is in this very voice that the past continues to speak to us to this day. Then it is worth remembering the main thing. If you hear a word that no one can explain, do not rush to dismiss it as a trifle. If an old building does not fit into the usual chronology, that too is a sign. If a document contains the dry phrase about the Great Sea, but there is no date, no names, and no details, then something has already been cut out of memory. Remember the people whose language disappeared before it received its name. Remember the archives that burned too often, too conveniently, too timely. Many nations that seem ancient and unchanging took shape over just a few decades. They were assembled step by step, through schools, maps, censuses, and new textbooks. And so the main question remains. What exactly did the creators of the new order hide behind the beautiful version of the past? Perhaps the answer still lies nearby. In a dusty folder in a district archive, in an old lullaby, in the stone of a wall whose masonry technique no one remembers anymore. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel and like the video. See you soon.